In 2007, reindeer herders on the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia found something in a riverbank exposed by erosion. A mammoth calf, female, 1 month old at the time of her death, approximately 42,000 years ago, preserved so completely by permafrost that the trunk was intact, the eyes were intact, the stomach still contained her mother's milk. Researchers named her Lyuba, from the Russian word for love. She's the most complete mammoth specimen ever recovered. Her skin is intact, her eyelashes are intact. Under a microscope, researchers could examine the individual cells of her organs. She died, the evidence suggests, by inhaling mud at a watering hole, choking to death in a moment of ordinary misfortune, and then being preserved by the cold for 42 millennia, while everything around her changed beyond recognition. Lyuba is extraordinary, but she is also, in the context of what the permafrost has given back across Siberia, not unique. Dozens of mammoth specimens preserved in various states of completeness have been recovered from frozen ground across Russia, Siberia, and Alaska. Each one adds to a picture that overturns in different ways nearly everything popular culture has assumed about Mammuthus primigenius. The woolly mammoth is the most recognizable extinct animal in the world. It is also one of the most misunderstood. And the misunderstanding is not small. It goes to the center of what the animal was, how it lived, what it felt, and what its disappearance actually meant for the world it left behind. Start with what you think you know. A big hairy elephant. Cold adapted, probably dumb, probably slow, probably not much different from a modern elephant, except for the fur and the tusks and the time period. A simpler version of something we still have, a prototype. That is wrong in almost every particular. Begin with the blood. In 2010, a team of researchers at Pennsylvania State University accomplished something that had never been done before. They extracted the genes encoding hemoglobin from mammoth DNA, synthesized the ancient proteins in a laboratory, and tested how those proteins behaved under varying temperature conditions. The results were striking. Mammoth hemoglobin released oxygen to tissues at low temperatures with an efficiency that modern elephant hemoglobin cannot match. In cold conditions, modern elephant hemoglobin holds onto oxygen too tightly, making it less available to working muscles and organs. Mammoth hemoglobin had been modified by 3 specific mutations that changed its binding properties, allowing it to release oxygen efficiently, even when body temperatures dropped in peripheral tissues exposed to Arctic cold. This was not fur, this was not fat. This was a molecular adaptation written into the blood itself that allowed the mammoth cells to function in conditions that would impair a modern elephant at the biochemical level. The woolly mammoth was not an elephant that grew fur. It was an animal that had been rebuilt at the level of its proteins for a world of cold. The hemoglobin was not the only molecular adaptation. Mammoth DNA, which has now been sequenced in near complete form from multiple permafrost specimens, shows alterations in genes related to fat metabolism, circadian rhythms, insulin signaling, and the sensory receptors that detect cold temperature in peripheral nerves. The cold receptors specifically appear to have been modified to reduce sensitivity to low temperatures, a change that would reduce the discomfort and physiological stress signals triggered by cold exposure. Mammoth nerve endings were less alarmed by cold than a modern elephant's would be. The animal was not simply tolerating an environment that should have been painful. It had been modified to not experience that environment as painful in the same way. Now the fur, because the fur is where the mammoth's adaptation to cold becomes visible, and where the full sophistication of the thermal system the permafrost specimens reveal becomes clear. The woolly mammoth had 3 layers. The outermost layer consisted of long guard hairs, reaching up to 35 inches or 90 centimeters in length on some specimens. Coarse and hollow in structure, water-resistant, shed wind and moisture away from the body. The middle layer was dense, woolly underfur, fine and tightly crimped, trapping air and providing the primary insulation. Beneath the underfur, the skin itself was underlaid by a fat layer up to 3.5 inches, 9 centimeters thick, continuous across the body, providing both insulation and an energy reserve that the animal drew on during the lean months of the Arctic winter. The ears were small, roughly 1/10 the surface area of an African elephant's ears, minimizing the heat loss that large ear surface areas inevitably produce. The tail was short. Every external feature was a calibrated solution to the same problem, and the solution worked at temperatures that would kill a modern African elephant within hours. The hump. Photographs and paintings of woolly mammoths typically show a sloping back, higher at the shoulder than at the hip. This is anatomically accurate, but misunderstood in its function. The hump was not skeletal. It was not a structural feature of the spine. The elevated shoulder profile of the woolly mammoth came from a combination of tall neural spines on the thoracic vertebra, and, critically, a deposit of fat and muscle that accumulated above those spines. The hump was a fuel tank, a reserve of energy stored in a specific location, available to be metabolized during winter when food was scarce and the caloric demands of staying warm were at their highest. Camels store fat in their humps for the same functional reason. The woolly mammoth arrived at the same solution independently, at a larger scale, in a colder environment. The tusks. This is where Mammuthus primigenius most dramatically separates from any living elephant, and where the fossil record has preserved something that changes how the entire animal is understood. Woolly mammoth tusks were long, curved and spiraled. The largest known mammoth tusks measured over 14 feet, 4.3 meters in length. They were not straight. They curved outward and upward and then back inward in a sweep that created a tool of extraordinary versatility. And like the woolly rhino's horn, the tusks show wear patterns that tell you exactly what they were used for. The underside of woolly mammoth tusks, in specimen after specimen, shows a specific pattern of abrasion, flat, polished, worn along the lower surface in a way that is inconsistent with combat, inconsistent with display, and entirely consistent with the same sweeping motion that the woolly rhino's horn shows. Snow sweeping. The mammoth used its tusks to clear snow from the surface of the ground, exposing the frozen grasses and sedges beneath. This is documented behavior in modern Asian elephants that use their tusks to strip bark and dig, and the wear pattern on mammoth tusks matches the wear pattern you would expect from an animal sweeping ice and compacted snow repeatedly across decades of life. The tusks were not weapons first. They were tools first. Shovels of bone and ivory, calibrated by millions of years of evolution to the specific problem of accessing vegetation under snow. The stomach contents of permafrost specimens have confirmed what the tusk wear suggests about diet. Lyuba's stomach contained milk. Adult specimens have yielded plant material in various stages of digestion: grasses, sedges, herbaceous plants, flowers in some cases, preserved well enough to identify at the species level. The woolly mammoth was a grazer, operating on the mammoth steppe, the vast cold grassland of the Pleistocene, selecting for the same types of vegetation across an enormous geographic range. A fully grown adult required roughly 400 pounds, 180 kilograms of vegetation per day, to fuel the metabolic demands of staying warm in Arctic conditions. That daily requirement drove the mammoth to cover large distances, and those large distances made it something more than a consumer. But the stomach contents reveal something else that rarely gets discussed. Mammoth feces preserved in permafrost contain seeds. Dozens of species of seeds, in concentrations that indicate the mammoth was not simply eating plants, but moving through the landscape as a seed dispersal agent, depositing viable seeds across distances that no other animal in its ecosystem could match. The mammoth was not simply a consumer of the mammoth steppe, it was one of the forces that maintained it. A detail from the permafrost record reinforces the social picture. Multiple mammoth individuals found together at several sites, adults and juveniles in close proximity, in positions consistent with a group that converged at a single location and died in sequence over a short period. The groupings match the family unit structure of modern elephants, where juveniles remain close to adult females, and the group moves and feeds as a coordinated unit. The mammoth did not move through the steppe alone. It moved in company, with animals it had known for years, in relationships the fossil record cannot fully document, but that the brain size and the grouping patterns both imply. Modern elephants are ecosystem engineers. They push over trees, creating clearings. They dig water holes that other species use. They compact soil and create pathways. They disperse seeds. They shape their environments in ways that the entire ecological community around them depends on. The woolly mammoth almost certainly did the same, at the scale of an ecosystem that spanned a continent. The mammoth steppe, the most productive cold grassland in Earth's history, was not simply the mammoth's habitat. It was, in part, the mammoth's creation. The trampling, the grazing pressure, the seed dispersal, the compaction of snow that allowed grasses to survive winter more successfully. All of it was driven in significant part by the presence of millions of mammoths moving through the landscape over hundreds of thousands of years. When the mammoths disappeared, the ecosystem did not simply lose its largest animal, it lost its engineer. The mammoth steppe, deprived of the grazing pressure and seed dispersal and soil management that the mammoths provided, began to transition. Forests expanded. The grasslands contracted. The ecological community that had depended on mammoth-maintained open habitat lost the force that maintained it. The extinction of the woolly mammoth was not simply the loss of a species. It was the removal of a keystone process that had shaped an entire biome for hundreds of thousands of years. The social life. This is where the mammoth earns something that goes beyond ecology and enters the territory of what we call, carefully and with appropriate scientific caution, inner life. Mammoth brains were large, comparable in size and complexity to modern elephant brains. Modern elephants have demonstrated mourning behavior, self-recognition, tool use, complex communication, including infrasound calls below the range of human hearing that carry for miles across open landscape, and social bonds within matriarchal family groups that persist across decades. There is no direct evidence that mammoths did all of these things, but the brain structure, the social organization implied by the groupings of specimens found together in bone beds, and the straightforward logic that an animal with a modern elephant-sized brain living in a social group under the same ecological pressures as modern elephants would develop comparable social capabilities, all point in the same direction. The woolly mammoth was not a lumbering, solitary animal operating on instinct. It was a socially sophisticated animal with a brain capable of memory, recognition, communication, and whatever form of emotional life those capabilities produce in a large-brained social mammal. The last mammoths were not where you think they were. They were not when you think they were. The mainland population of woolly mammoths disappeared approximately 10,000 years ago. As the Pleistocene ended and the climate warmed and the mammoth steppe contracted, but a population of mammoths survived on Wrangel Island, a remote Arctic island in the Chukchi Sea north of Siberia, in isolation from the mainland. These island mammoths were cut off as sea levels rose at the end of the last glacial period, stranded on an island where the combination of isolation reduced competition, and limited resources drove them toward dwarfism. The Wrangel Island mammoths were smaller than their mainland ancestors, reduced by island conditions to a fraction of the continental body size, and they survived. They survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, which means that woolly mammoths were alive while the pyramids of Giza were being built, while the Bronze Age was underway in Europe and the Middle East, while Stonehenge was in active use. The woolly mammoth is not a creature of the deep prehistoric past in the way that framing implies. It is an animal that went extinct in recorded human history, on an island that humans had simply not yet reached in sufficient numbers to hunt. When humans did reach Wrangel Island, the mammoths disappeared within 1,000 years. The pattern is the same on the mainland, scaled to a small island and a small population. The last Wrangel mammoth showed signs of genetic deterioration from the inbreeding that isolation and small population size inevitably produce. They were already compromised. The human arrival was the final pressure on a population that had nowhere left to contract to. They did not go extinct because the Ice Age ended. The Ice Age had ended 6,000 years before the last Wrangel mammoth died. They went extinct because an island that had kept them safe from mainland hunting pressure was no longer beyond reach. There is one more detail the permafrost preserved that deserves its own moment: the hair. Mammoth hair recovered from permafrost specimens has been analysed at the structural level under electron microscopy and compared to the hair of living cold-adapted mammals. The structure is unique. The medullary cells at the core of each hair shaft are arranged differently from modern elephant hair, in a configuration that increases the insulating properties of the individual fibre. The mammoth did not simply have more hair than a modern elephant. It had structurally different hair, engineered at the level of individual fibre architecture, for a function that a modern elephant hair shaft cannot perform. This detail is not in any popular account of the woolly mammoth. It is in the literature. It is one of dozens of similar details across the biology of Mammothus primigenius that add up to the same conclusion. This was not an elephant in a coat. It was something else that happened to share an ancestor with the elephant. From multiple individuals across a time span of tens of thousands of years, allowing researchers to reconstruct not just the genetic blueprint of a single animal, but the population history, the genetic diversity, the bottlenecks and expansions and relationships between different mammoth populations across the Pleistocene. And that genome is now being used for something that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. Colossal Biosciences, a company founded in 2021, is working to introduce key woolly mammoth genes into Asian elephant cell lines with the stated goal of producing a cold-adapted elephant capable of surviving Arctic conditions. Not a cloned mammoth, something new. An animal carrying the hemoglobin adaptations, the fat metabolism genes, the cold receptor modifications, the fur-producing genes, edited into the closest living relative of the mammoth, using technology that did not exist when the last mammoth died. Whether this is achievable, whether it is wise, whether the animal produced would be a mammoth in any meaningful sense or simply an elephant with a different coat, is debated with considerable intensity in both scientific and ethical circles. What is not debated is that the genome exists, that the information required to understand what the mammoth was at the molecular level is available in a way that is true of no other extinct species. The mammoth is the most scientifically accessible extinct animal in history. 42,000 years after Lyuba inhaled mud at a Siberian watering hole, her cells gave up their secrets to a sequencing machine in a laboratory. The information inside them is being used to try to bring something back. Nothing about the woolly mammoth was normal. Not the blood that worked differently from any living elephant's, not the fur system of 3 layers over 3 inches of fat, over skin modified at the genetic level to feel cold differently, not the tusks worn smooth on their undersides from a lifetime of clearing snow, not the role as engineer of the largest cold grassland ecosystem in Earth's history, not the social sophistication inside a brain as large and as complex as a modern elephant's, not the survival of a dwarf island population into the era of the pyramids, not the genome that has now been read in full 40 millennia after the animal died, and not the ending, an ending that was not geological, not inevitable, not the result of a world the mammoth could not adapt to, an ending that happened on an island to a small population already weakened by isolation within 1,000 years of human arrival, in the era of the Bronze Age, when the rest of the world was already building cities. The permafrost is thawing. The same frozen ground that preserved Lyuba for 42,000 years is releasing her contemporaries, one by one, as the temperatures rise. More specimens are emerging, more stomachs with identifiable plant material, more DNA, more information about an animal that existed for 400,000 years and left more of itself behind than any extinct species in history. We are not done learning what the mammoth was. We are, in some ways, only beginning. And somewhere in a laboratory, the genes of an animal that died on a Siberian riverbank 42,000 years ago are being read, letter by letter, by machines that the last mammoth never knew were coming. The mammoth did not know it was going. It did not know it was the last. It was alive, and then it was not, the way all animals end, without the knowledge of what the ending means. What it left behind was everything: bones in permafrost, milk in a calf's stomach, a genome in a sequencing machine, and the absence of an engineer in a grassland that has never fully recovered from losing it. Nothing about any of that is normal either.